he knows the suffering exists. If he's all powerful, he has the power to remove the suffering. And if he's so all loving, well, then he doesn't want anybody to suffer, so he would remove all of the suffering. But the fact is that suffering is still here, and that to them proves that God does not exist. But notice again the logical flaw in their argumentation. So far, we do not have a definite proof that God does not exist, because there may be good reasons for God to allow suffering to exist, even though he knows that suffering is there, he's powerful enough to remove it, and he may have good reasons for wanting to remove the suffering, because he's loving and kind, but at the same time, he may have some good reasons, better reasons for permitting some suffering than for removing all of them. And it is for those good reasons that he might allow the suffering. So the atheist argument, which on the surface appears to be a logical deduction from some accepted premises, in fact is not a logical deduction. The premises do not lead inevitably to the stated conclusion, because there is a missing premise. The missing premise is that there might be some reasons for God to allow suffering in the world. Are there some reasons for God to allow suffering in the world? Yes, Muslims are aware of some such reasons. For example, what do you make of the idea that God is testing us in this world? The fact that God is testing us in this world requires that there is going to be a variety. How wide should be that variety has to be left to the wisdom of God. It's not for us to dictate. But that very variety means that you will have a range of experiences between good and bad. You'll have good experiences and bad ones. You'll have good times and bad times. You will have times of prosperity and times of economic hardship. You will have good health and bad health. You will have joy and you will have suffering. So the two will exist in a range. How wide should be that range? That's a different question, and we leave that to God. But the fact that there is going to be this range means that there is always going to be somebody jubilant and happy and another person complaining. It doesn't have to require a great deal of suffering for a person to complain. Just the minor inconveniences of daily life will give people reason to complain. It goes 1 degree colder and somebody is complaining. It goes 1 degree warmer and somebody else is complaining. It rains one day and somebody who was planning to have a picnic starts to complain. But a farmer who was hoping for rain for his crops is now happy because he can actually have some crops. And in fact, if the farmer gets a good crop, then we'll have something to eat and we can pack some sandwiches and go out on a picnic. So what might appear to be bad in a certain situation may be good in another situation. What appears to be bad for one person might be good for another person. And God has to do a great balancing act in keeping everyone as happy as possible and creating the world in such a way that it will produce the maximum good possible while at the same time retaining some of the essential features of the kind of world that God wanted to create. So the fact that God is testing us in this life actually requires that range. One has to be tested. If one is always in the same situation, there is no test. Nothing changes. But if there is a change, how do you respond to that change? So you had money and now you have none. Where does your faith lie? Does it lie in the wealth which is gone and your faith has gone with it? Or is your faith in Allah Azza wa Jal which remains whether the wealth comes or goes? You are being tested. You're being tested in wealth as you are being tested in poverty. When you have wealth, do you celebrate the glory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and give thanks to Him? When you have poverty, do you have patience and sabr and turn to Allah Azza wa Jal? Life is a test, and that requires this sort of variety. This life is not the entire existence of a human being. We believe in the life hereafter. So there may be some inconveniences here which will be compensated for in the life hereafter. According to a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, amazing is the situation of the believer. If a thorn pricks the believer, he praises Allah Azza wa Jal, and that gets stored up for him as a reward in the life hereafter. So it doesn't matter what happens to the believer, the final outcome for the believer is good. A person may look may look at a large canvas and notice by zooming in that there is a tiny spot on that large canvas. So look at the curtain behind me, and let's say I zoom in here and I find one little red spot right there. Now you can't see it because you're too far away, but if I zoom in, I see it right there. There is no red spot, but let's assume there is one, okay? So I zoom in and I see that red spot because I'm looking close up. But if I stand back and see the big picture, there is no red spot. From the point of view of God, God looks at the entire big picture, not only this life, but the entire eternity. And he sees the final good that manifests itself, that is the outcome of everything that has transpired in this life. But we see that which is close, that which is adna, according to the way the Quran speaks of this world. It is near to us. That's what we see. That's what we're preoccupied with. We only see the evil and suffering of this world. We don't see that in the final outcome. People who have served Allah Azza wa Jal and they have been admitted into paradise. People who have disobeyed Allah Azza wa Jal have been forgiven and they have been admitted into paradise. So that the final outcome is such that the way that our God sees it is that ultimately good prevails. And this world, with all of its evil and suffering, still leads to an ultimate good. What about free will? The human ability to choose between good and bad. In the story of the creation of Adam in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala announces to the angels. You've read Surah Al-Baqarah. وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. When your Lord said to the angels, I'm going to create a Khalifa on earth. What did the angels say? أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَن يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا. Are you going to create on earth someone who will cause corruption therein? وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاء. And he's going to shed blood? وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. And we are always considering you to be holy, and we are singing your praises. So the angels are wondering about this. It didn't seem to make sense to them. They are continually worshiping Allah, singing His praises, celebrating His glory, never deviating from His commandment. And now they learn about a creature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place on earth to be His representatives, such creatures as will have the ability to cause corruption on earth and to shed blood. Why would Allah create such human beings? Now this is the atheist question already asked by the angels. Why is there evil and suffering in the world? Why would God create such beings who would have this capacity to commit wrong and do evil? Allah does not spell out the answer there. But He just assures them that He knows what He's doing. قَالَ إِنِّي أَعْلَمُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. He said, I know that which you do not know. And then He gives them some clue to what the answer might contain. He teaches Adam alayhi salam some special knowledge. And then He challenges the angels to come up with that, to name the objects. And they couldn't. They said, we have no knowledge, إِلَّا مَا عَلَّمْتَنَا, except that which you have taught us. They have to confess, إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. You are Alim and a Hakim. You are the knowledgeable and the wise one. So Allah Azza wa Jal has His reasons for why He has created human beings. He's given human beings that sort of special knowledge, that consciousness, that ability to differentiate between right and wrong, so that He does not have to straitjacket all human beings to generate the good results that He wants. He can create us and give us freedom within certain limits, the freedom to choose to do that which is right. He's given us the intelligence to recognize right and to shun the wrong. But that means that He has to put up with the real possibility that some people will misuse that intelligence and that ability and that free choice, and they will do wrong instead. So a certain amount of wrong will happen in the universe, not because God wants it or desires it, but because that is desirable in itself as part of a grander scheme which entails the freedom of human beings. What's the point of human beings having that freedom? So the angels are worshiping Allah Azza wa Jal all of the time, and they don't deviate from that. What is the difference between automatic obedience and deliberate obedience? We know what is automatic obedience. Your cell phone works precisely the way you want it to. If it's ringing in the middle of an audience like this, it's because you left it on. So that's automatic obedience. It does what you program it to do. And nobody strokes a cell phone and says, good cell phone, beautiful. Maybe some of the brothers do that with their cars. Nice car, love you, baby. But, in a sane moment, we recognize that the machines that serve us precisely the way they're programmed to serve us, and there's nothing good or bad about the way in which they're doing it. They're just simply doing what they're programmed to do. If it fails, blame the mechanic, blame the engineer, not the machine. Sometimes in anger, somebody kicks a piece of machinery and says, bad machine. No, the machine isn't bad. Somebody has programmed it wrong. So that's automatic obedience. The obedience itself does not have any moral value. But what about deliberate obedience? What if you have a child who obeys you even in your absence? What if you have a young kid who sees the cookies but does not take the cookies even when you're absent? Then that child becomes so special to you because he or she had the opportunity and the ability to disobey, but they chose not to disobey. That chosen obedience, that deliberate obedience is so special. And that is what Allah desires from human beings. He gives us the ability to do wrong, and now He Himself can boast to the angels on the day of Eid. Look at my servants, they're going out for the Eid prayer. They have completed the fast in the month of Ramadan. These are my servants. You are asking, why did I create people who will commit evil and cause corruption on earth? Look at them now. Of course, He won't get that result from everyone. He doesn't expect that result from everyone. But He wants the chosen few, those who will, in turn, choose to serve Him. So in order to create that, He has to put up with the fact that some people will be evil. So you see, there will be evil and suffering in the world. Not because God desires it, and not because He does not have the ability to remove it, but because this serves some greater purpose. It may be to test human beings. It may be due to the evil that human beings and other creatures of God perpetrate by the very fact that God gave the freedom of choice, which itself is a necessary ingredient to promote the greater good of people choosing to love God and to serve Him. So you see, in sum, the main atheist argument which says that God cannot exist because of the fact that there is evil and suffering in the world actually fails. And in the end, there is no good reason for believing that God does not exist. And that's simply put. There may be some reason for somebody to say, I don't really know. I'm an agnostic. I haven't seen sufficient evidence to convince me that God exists. That is an intellectually justifiable position. We can sympathize with such a person, and we might expect that such a person will have the willingness to learn. And we might have an opportunity to share something of what we know about our God with that person. But the person who says there is no God must have checked everywhere to find out that really God does not exist. Moreover, he or she must have some good logical reasons for thinking that God does not exist. And we've seen that the real one reason they have is the presence of suffering in the world, and that does not really hold up. To begin with, it is not a logical deduction, even though it might have the appearance of being one. And furthermore, we have seen that there is a missing premise, that being that God may have good reasons for allowing evil and suffering to exist in the world, even though he has the power to remove it, he has the knowledge that it is there, and he is loving and kind, and in that case, he does not want people to suffer. On the other hand, are there positive reasons for thinking that God exists? Yes, there is. Well, to begin with, we should say that for the believer, a positive reason is hardly necessary other than the bare knowledge and experience of the believer. For believers in this room, I think it goes without saying that you know that God exists. And you don't know how you know it, you just know it. Alvin Plantinga, a philosopher, has held that in fact the belief in God is a basic part of the human psyche. It is something that is already basic to the believer. It's not something that you have to acquire over time. You just simply know it. It's intrinsic to you. So in that case, you don't have to really explain why you believe that God exists. You just know him. If I have a certain friend, and I know him, now that's my friend, and I know him. The fact that somebody else doesn't know him doesn't mean that my friend does not exist. And in fact, I don't have to prove to the other person that my friend exists. I just know my friend, and he exists, and for me, that's the end of it. So for the believer, God exists. A Muslim reads his Quran. A Muslim goes to make Hajj. And in all of these experiences, whether you're making salat or you're fasting, you have the real sense that God is present in your life, and he is a reality to whom you're speaking and who is watching over you. So you don't need any further reason than this. The philosopher Tom Morris, in his book Philosophy for Dummies, actually tells us that there is a principle in philosophy known as the principle of belief conservation. And what that principle entails is that we generally believe many things for which we do not require proof. Think about many things that you believe for which you do not require proof. I believe that the man I know to be my father is my father. I don't have any actual tangible proof for this except my lifelong experience that this is my father. I have no doubt about it, and I've never been required to prove it, but this is something I've accepted without absolute proof. And we have accepted many things in our lives without absolute proof. We accept things based on science, based on indications, based on some circumstantial evidence. In fact, many a case is decided based on circumstantial evidence. So when we ourselves are convinced of something, we believe something, we should not give up that belief, according to this principle of belief conservation. We should conserve that belief. We should not give up that belief unless we are given positive evidence against it. Now that does not, you see what the principle holds. The principle doesn't say that you dogmatically insist, no matter what, I won't look at any evidence, I just believe. It's not saying that. It's saying that what you already believe, you hold on to, unless someone proves the contrary to you. So it's not that you have to prove that your belief is right. It's the other person who has to prove to you that your belief is wrong. So I have a friend, I know him, I believe in my friend, I don't have to prove to you that my friend exists, but if you think my friend does not exist, okay, you tell me why you think my friend does not exist. Now, to begin with, I think you're crazy, but okay, I'm going to give you a chance. Tell me, why do you think my friend does not exist? Let me hear you. I want to hear your reasons. You see? So we believe that God exists. We don't have to prove to somebody else that God exists. But if somebody is saying to us, no, that's just a figment of your imagination. That's just a delusion. God does not exist. So then we can say, okay, I think you're crazy, brother. But can you please tell me why you feel that way? I'm very interested. I want to know why you feel that way, because I know that God is real, and you're saying he doesn't exist. I want to know what's on your mind, what you've been smoking, brother. Tell me, why do you believe that God does not exist? And so we have seen already that the atheist does not really have a good argument and a positive reason for thinking that God does not exist. So that's my first point, that the believer does not really have to come up with any further proof other than his own experience and his own knowledge that God exists. But besides this, one can step aside and say, okay, let's take it from a neutral starting point and see if there are reasons for thinking that God exists, if we just try to intellectualize the matter. And here philosophers have in fact offered some reasons, three of them I believe I can share with you very quickly given the time constraints. In fact, these are the three main arguments that I would provide anyway, even if I had a long time, all right? And they're three powerful arguments. Now, the arguments do not each by themselves prove the whole thing, but each proves a part of what we want to arrive at. And so what we have here is a cumulative argument. It's not a chain argument where A leads to B and B leads to C, and so if you take one link out of the chain, the entire argument fails. This is a cumulative argument, meaning that you have each argument pointing in a certain direction, like many arrows pointing to the same conclusion. And so if you remove one of the arrows, you still have the others pointing. But because you have so many pointing in the same direction, you get the sense that that direction really is the right one to look at. So let's look at these arguments. First of all, the universe exists. No one will deny that. Well, some people will, but I'll explain to you why they do. Almost everyone will say that the universe exists. I exist, you exist, and we live in a world that exists. Well then, where does this universe come from? How does it exist? The philosopher Keith Ward, in his book God, Chance, and Necessity, says that there are really three possibilities for how the universe exists. One is the possibility that comes naturally to the believer to think that God created the universe. If not that, then what? Then two other possibilities. Either the universe came into existence by some chance process, that just by some random event it came into existence, or it came into existence by some necessity, or it exists by its own necessity. Now, if anyone were to think, does the universe exist by necessity? Is there anything that dictates that the universe must exist? There's nothing like this. When believers speak about God who must exist. Now that's for the believer true by definition. We're not asking for the moment, is that really true in fact, but at least it is true by definition for the believer. God is such that he must exist. We cannot imagine that God does not exist. True? So for the believer, God must exist. But is there some believer in the universe who says, I believe the universe must exist? There's no such person. There's no one who can claim that the universe, by virtue of itself, must exist, as if the universe itself is a God. So then, I think we can comfortably conclude that there is no reason for thinking that the universe must necessarily exist. But then that leads to the other possibility, that perhaps the universe came into being by some random process, by some chance. But as Dr. Keith Ward points out, even what we are calling chance, now the suffering. So the atheist argument, which on the surface appears to be a logical deduction from some accepted premises, in fact is not a logical deduction. The premises do not lead inevitably to the stated conclusion, because there is a missing premise. The missing premise is that there might be some reasons for God to allow suffering in the world. He knows the suffering exists. If he's all-powerful, he has the power to remove the suffering. And if he's so all-loving, well, then he doesn't want anybody to suffer, so he would remove all of the suffering. But the fact is that suffering is still here, and that to them proves that God does not exist. But notice again the logical flaw in their argumentation. So far, we do not have a definite proof that God does not exist of experiences between good and bad. You'll have good experiences and bad ones. You'll have good times and bad times. You will have times of prosperity and times of economic hardship. You will have good health and bad health. You will have joy and you will have suffering. So the two will exist in a range. How wide should be that range? That's a different question. Because there may be good reasons for God to allow suffering to exist, even though he knows that suffering is there. He's powerful enough to remove it. And he may have good reasons for wanting to remove the suffering because he's loving and kind. But at the same time, he may have some good reasons, better reasons for permitting some suffering than for removing all of them. And it is for those good reasons that he might allow the world. Are there some reasons for God to allow suffering in the world? Yes, Muslims are aware of some such reasons. For example, what do you make of the idea that God is testing us in this world? The fact that God is testing us in this world requires that there is going to be a variety. How wide should be that variety has to be left to the wisdom of God. It's not for us to dictate. But that very variety means that you will have a range